Hello, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be truing a crankshaft on my CT110. If that's something you're interested in, as usual, stick around and I'll get straight into it. So I've put the crankshaft in my homemade truing stand. I've got two dial gauges. You can use one gauge, but it's easier with two, and it's better to demonstrate as well with two. And I've also got this little training aid. It's a two jar lids and a couple of bolts, and that's simulating a crankshaft and the faults that can happen within a crank. We can have the webs pinched together like this, we can have the webs spread like this, and we can have the webs twisted against each other like this, or a combination of all three things. And what we can see, if the webs are spread like this reading will read low with this pin at the top, and it will read high with the pin at the bottom. Now obviously a pinched one will be the opposite way, and when the webs are twisted with the pin to the front, you can see obviously this will read high. With the pin to the back, this would read low. Hope that helps to explain the various readings. And if your crank is badly out of true, it can cause excess vibration, and the bearings, the main bearings that fit on here and here, they will bear the brunt of that. It will reduce the life of your engine, reduce the life of the main bearings, and just be an uncomfortable ride as well. And this is one reason why it's not a good idea to use a rattle gun to remove the flywheel and the clutch. Try to avoid that. If you see how easy it is to knock the crank and move it out of true, it's only simply pressed together. The pin, the crank pin and the webs are only pressed together. Try not to use a rattle gun. You may move your crank out of true. The cranks leave the factory with a spec of 0.025. That's 1 thousandth of an inch, and the service limit is 0.1 of a millimeter, or 4 thou. The gauges here, so 0.1 would be 10 there. Each mark is 0.01. We need to get the crank back to the factory spec of 0.025 and well within the service limit. Let's give it a rotate and see what happens. As you can see, the needles are both moving in sync, both moving together to the left. The dial gauges are reading low with the pin at the top, and are reading high with the pin at the bottom. And what that means is the crank webs are spread apart. What we need to do is squeeze the crankshaft in the vise there, squeeze the webs together, and see if we can't bring this back to spec. So I've squeezed the crankshaft in the vise, pressed the two webs together, I've put the crank back in the stand. Let's rotate it. I've reset the gauges to 0. What's happening? With the crank pin at the top, the gauges are reading high. With the crank pin at the bottom, the gauges are reading low. And what that means is I've pinched the webs in too far in the vise. I was a bit ham-fisted, and what I need to do is place a wedge in between the webs and bring that back out. Let's try that. So let's have a look. So we are 0.7. So although we're within the service limit, we're well over what a standard crank should be. As this crank moves up to the top, this goes into the negative, and that means this is low. So that means the webs are spread apart. I'll pinch it slightly in the vise, put it back in the stand and have another look. And that's another pinch. Let's see what we've got this time. So we are getting slowly better. This side is just about in service limit. This side is still a little bit off, and I think that's caused by the web being twisted slightly. But let's continue on, see if we can't get it any better. Let's just have another look. So higher with the crank pin at the front, lower with the crank pin at the rear. And what that means is we need to strike the crank web just here with a copper face mallet and move the crank web on the crank pin and bring this back into true. Let's try that. So this has taken quite a long time, in and out of the truing stand, gradual adjustments. You need a lot of patience for this job, which I sometimes don't have. And what I finally got, I think I've got it right to about 0.025, which is what they leave the factory with, and well within the service limit of 0.1. So let's just have a quick look. And what happens, you can only get it so far, and then it goes the opposite way, if you know what I mean. So I'm happy with that. I've made up a different truing stand, held in the centres with the gauges at approximately 35 mils out from the webs, because I wanted to see the difference in the readings between holding the crank at the ends, suspending it at the ends, or on a truing stand like this. This is the same crank from before, and as we saw before, it was more or less 0.025 or 1 thou. Let's have a look at the readings from this crank on this truing stand and see the difference. So the right hand side, barely moving. The left, about 0.15. So that's pretty good. I hope you learnt something from this. I certainly did, and I learned that I don't have as much patience as I'd like. Thanks for your support, thanks for watching, and hello to Jane and Paul in Woodsets. You know who you are. See you in the next video.